who is Dr. Soma Adhikari. He is a pediatric endocrinologist at Children's Health there at UT Southwest. He's an associate professor there and one of the medical directors for Camp Sweeney, which is the largest residential summer camp for children with type 1 diabetes in the world. He's earned his medical degree from the University of Miami and completed his residency and fellowship in pediatric endo at Southwestern. He points out one of his accolades is being awarded the White Hat Award, which is awarded each year to the graduating resident that's voted by all the other residents to be the one selected to be most likely to be their own child's pediatrician. So that speaks very highly to Dr. Adhikari's clinical care. His research interests as well as clinical interests are around looking at electronic health records to improve outcomes, especially related to endocrine disorders. And he's been awarded the best pediatric specialist for many years now. So again, definite testimony. So we're really thrilled to have him this morning. He's going to start off with a presentation on diabetes technology. And so let me get things ready for him and I'll pass off the microphone.
But it's an honor to be here. As Dr. Triggestad said, I'm one of the peds endos down in Dallas at UT Southwestern. This is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. Also, as she said, I am one of the medical directors at camp. If you've never been up to camp or down to camp or wherever it is for you, we would love to have you. Come find me. We'd love to show you around, encourage more of your kids to come, et cetera, et cetera. One of the things that I get to do at camp every year is help with the training for all the medical staff who come to camp. Camp is something that runs only because of the hundreds of people who help us every summer. And as I think about talking about diabetes technology and giving an update, I can't tell if it's echoing in my ears, but I don't know if that means it's perfect. It was only a couple summers ago that towards the conclusion of a training day for our senior medical staff. So our senior med staff are often college students, medical students who've been with us for years. That one of the med staff looked at me and said, I've been coming to camp for a few years now, and it seems like diabetes care just keeps getting reinvented every year. And that was a little bit of an aha moment for me, because I think these are people who are exposed to diabetes for a few months every summer, and then they go back to their non-med staff lives, and then they come back again next summer. And to hear it from them, we live it every day. We kind of see it, and we see the rate of progress. But to hear it from somebody who's only exposed to it every so often and who pops in and really feels that, wow, I thought I understood diabetes care a year ago, but here I am, everything seems to be different just 9 months later. It was a little bit of a wake up for me that, yeah, we've really experienced and continue to experience just dramatic change with regards to all the tools that are available to our kids with diabetes. And it's been an exciting time to be a provider in the midst of all of this rapid change. So over the course of the next 30 or 45 minutes, I hope to give you a little bit of insight into some of the things that I consider to be highlights of some of those changes. I don't have any conflicts of interest to declare per se, but I will be talking from time to time about some non-FDA approved things, especially as we look ahead to things that are not yet approved, but which are hopefully coming down the horizon. So a couple of assumptions that I'm going to make as I talk are that, I want to be respectful of my audience, meaning I'm not going to take a lot of time to explain that, all of these tools have benefits. I think we come from backgrounds where we understand what the evidence behind some of our tools is. I will show a little bit of data behind what some of the tools have demonstrated or how they've been demonstrated to be effective in terms of some of the newest data, but I'm not going to take a lot of time. Some of my team members heard me talk just a couple of days ago to a general pediatric audience about updates in diabetes care. And I did take a little bit of time to show, do we have evidence that some of this newer technology actually makes a difference when it comes to the lives of kids with diabetes? But I'm going to assume we're familiar with what some of the evidence behind the utility of our tools is and why we need it, for that matter, when it comes to diabetes outcomes across the country. We know we lag behind, right? We know that our adolescents live on average with A1Cs in the mid-9s. And that should satisfy none of us from the standpoint of what we're actually accomplishing across the country. These are US data. These are not just, people who are not coming to us or people who are not being cared for at large pediatric endocrine centers. Actually, these are our kids who are achieving these outcomes. And it suggests that we have a long ways to go. I'm also going to assume that we know how closed loop pumps work and the principle behind them and such. I'm not going to take a lot of time to talk about that we understand the basics of how our CGMs talk to our insulin delivery devices today in automated insulin delivery devices. And certainly if we have trainees in the audience or connected virtually and we need to pause and talk about any of that, I can. But for the most part, I'm going to assume that we have that foundational knowledge so that we can really talk about just what the latest developments have been in the last several months. And then in some cases, just in the last few weeks, what the latest developments have been. And then look ahead a little bit as to what we can think is coming down the near-term future pipeline. So let's go ahead and get started. I want to, before we get into some of the newest technology, take a minute to flash sensing technology is not going to go anywhere anytime soon. There's a number of reasons for that, but I want to talk a little bit about a couple of studies that caught my eye just in the last year or so with regards to the evidence behind the utility of flash sensing technology. I'm talking about the Libre, of course, when I think about flash sensing technology and differentiating flash technology from continuous glucose sensing technology. So we're going to talk in a second about the Libre 3 and other CGMs and developments in the CGM space. But before I do that, there were a couple of studies in the last couple of years on the utility of flash technology that really caught my eye that I think it's worth all of us being familiar with because these were not clinical trials. These were just large real world observational studies of the utility or the evidence behind the use of flash sensing technology in real world populations. Not a lot of pediatric numbers in these data, but some pediatric numbers. So this is data from across Europe. There's a couple of things that are worth pointing out here because this is the estimated A1C across all of the blood glucose measurements and how that correlates to how often people in the real world scan themselves. So this is data across 50,000 readers, 280,000 sensors. So again, large volume of data that accumulated in Europe from about 2014 to 2016. And it shows, amongst other things, the things that stood out to me. On average, these are European patients, real world, non-clinical trial participants. People in Europe are scanning themselves 14 times a day. I was surprised by how often people are scanning themselves across just observational data. And you can see the sort of interquartile range on that 14 is 10 to 20. So 75% of people are scanning themselves 10 or more times a day in this large real world observational data of just what's being uploaded passively through readers. And you can see, again, just a significant improvement in estimated A1C across increased scan frequency. That together with, these are data from France. This is showing the rate of diabetes-related hospitalizations in the 12 months after the initiation of flash sensing technology. And there was a dramatic drop in the first 12 months of diabetes-related hospitalizations. Again, in the French data, with just the real-world initiation of flash sensing technology for patients with diabetes. This isn't somebody was enrolled in a clinical trial. This was, they were given a often Libre 2 sensor, and their outcomes were looked at in the 12 months before they were started on the Libre, and then the 12 months after. And the dramatic drop-off in that complication rate really caught my eye as just the latest evidence that yes, technology has its benefits. Let's move on. Newer things, right? There's a lot on this slide that we could spend a lot of time on, but these are, of course, the two newest sensors to come on the market in the US. I'm not going to talk about Eversense much because it's not approved for the pediatric population still, but technically there are other sensors that are on the market. I'm not going to talk about Guardian 3 too much either in the comparison of Libre 3 to Dexcom products, just because it's a little bit older. We will come back to Medtronic in a minute, but what's on this slide? A lot of stuff that's come, and that's stuff that's coming soon. If you haven't seen, this was posted and started making the rounds on social media just in the last couple of days. So we have an official date now for when the G7 will be actually available to commercial patients. So this is February 17th. Doesn't mean all of our patients are going to be able to get it on the very first day that it's available. But if you weren't aware of the date, it has an official drop date now. But again, Libre 3, G7. I have a table in a second that I want to spend a little bit of time on, but even before we do that, the pictures sometimes tell the story a little bit better than the table does. So what do we already know, or what do we think we know as far as the G7 when it comes to what's going to make it a little bit different? First off, the size of a penny or 2 stacked pennies for the Libre, right? That's their marketing campaign. You can get a little bit of a feel for just how it compares and how we think of it, how it compares to the current generation devices, and you can get a direct comparison of the Libre 3 compared to the G7 and the size in the picture at the middle of the screen. A couple of other things are worth pointing out. Of course, sort of innate to that picture, most of you already know this already, but one of the things that makes the G7 different is that it doesn't have a separate transmitter anymore. I think that's something that our patients have been looking forward to for quite some time, and it's something that I as I think about, not selling it, but talking it up to patients, that's certainly something that I look forward to being able to tell patients. I do have a screenshot of the G7 app that I purposefully captured one segment of in that image, which is to show that unlike the G6 app, the G7 app will incorporate Clarity or Clarity views into the G7 app. So the Clarity app will not go away, is my understanding, but there will be less reliance on having a separate Clarity app because a lot of the functionality built into the current Clarity app will now just be subsumed by the new G7 app once it's available for use and download, including the ability to see what your time in range over the last 14, 30, 90 days has been without having to talk our patients into, don't you want to also have this other app, and don't you want to log into that every so often? Is the audio? Uh-oh. I can switch to this microphone if that would make things easier. Can that just be turned off? Oh, or that, sure. I will stand wherever you want me to. Okay, I'm gonna try to stay on camera so that hopefully we run into fewer technical issues. Okay, also a new applicator for the G7, sort of hinted at down at the bottom right-hand corner. This is all useful. It does have a new receiver as well. Oh no, whatever keys were pushed, now this isn't working. Okay. This is how my brain works. So I put this table together really selfishly for me, but recognizing it's a very busy slide and you're not going to absorb all of it. It's just how I think of new products that come online is, wait, how's that compared to whatever else you're comparing yourself with? And how's that compared to the older generation of your product? So this is a comparison of the last 2 generations of the 2 last products from Libre and Dexcom, right? There's a lot of information on this slide that I don't expect anybody to memorize and take away from here, but it just, again, how my brain works when I think about how do I want to talk and describe this new product to patients as I am sitting with them in a room about what makes some of these things different, just from top down, forget the dates, that's just sort of a curiosity, but of course, 14 days of wear still for the Libre 3. 10 days plus a 12-hour grace period is how they're describing it for the G7. That's essentially in the online community, it's been accepted as it's 10.5 days of wear. You can call it whatever you want to, but it's 10.5 days of wear. Every minute readings still for the Libre 3, every 5 minutes still for the G7. Other things that are important to everybody, and then some things that might be important to some people. 30-minute warm-up period for the G7, obviously a big just utilization factor. I want to talk in a second about 30-minute warm-up period, but if you're familiar with the concept of can you soak a G7, that doesn't mean waterproof, but can you put it on before you actually use it so that you essentially have no warm-up period at all? The answer is yes. But 30-minute warm-up period, I don't actually think about the difference in MARD or MARD as I talk to patients too much. They're both between 8 to 9%. It's interesting because the published data on the G7 make a big deal about the 8.1% MARD that's been advertised as specifically for the back of the arm. So for whatever reasons I don't necessarily appreciate yet, the MARD on the G7 seems to be best when worn on the back of the arm in the published data up to now. Does that mean that I think it's going to be best for every single individual patient on the back of the arm? That's not been my experience with any other product up to now. But again, MARD is such a helpful but not full story factor for me because MARD varies by day, varies by user, varies by blood sugar level, et cetera, et cetera. It's awfully comparable to the older generation products, maybe slight improvements. The size, I mean, we make a big deal about the size for both of these because it's important to users. We showed the pictures. I won't say too much more about the size, but the G7 advertises itself to be quote unquote 60% smaller than the G6. I do think that for some people, the water safety will matter. There's a fair bit of difference in terms of the waterproofing or what it's approved for as far as how long it can be worn underwater. Probably not too significant for the vast majority of users, but worth us knowing about for those of us who see a lot of individual patients with this. We talked about the app a little bit. Both of them will continue to offer very similar follow functionality to their previous generation. My understanding from listening to users and podcasts and other such things is the transition experience of going from G6 to G7 has been thought about. I mean, you will not have to make a separate Dexcom account if you are transitioning. All of your old data will still be part of your account. So for those of us who've been following patients and downloading their data, it's not like when they show up after a couple months of G7 use, we won't be able to compare it to any of their old data. It's still them. So all of their data will follow them as they transition to the new device. The one thing I don't know is if, and I just talked to Marcus earlier today about, will they have to re-add their followers when they upgrade to the new app? I don't have complete clarity on that yet. Couple of safety points that are, I think, worth us keeping in mind. The vitamin C warning still persists for Libre 3. The hydroxyurea contraindication still persists for G7, just as it has been present for G6. So neither of these things are new. What else? I talked about soaking. If you aren't familiar with what soaking means, that means you can put on your second sensor when you are in that tail end of your current sensor to effectively eliminate the warm-up period at all, or to effectively eliminate the window during which you have no data, if you want to. It does eliminate 30 minutes from your life of your sensor, so to speak, if you want to be that exact about it. But if the question is, can I put my second sensor on before my first sensor expires? The answer is yes. That's what people in the diabetes world refer to as soaking their sensors. No direct-to-watch capabilities out of the box, but the hardware to eventually implement direct-to-watch, meaning Apple Watch, is built into the G7. It will be a future software upgrade that will hopefully bring that functionality to our users. If you are familiar with the timeline of things, you probably know that the European launch of the G7 was months ago? Why was the European launch so far ahead of the US launch? The US FDA, one of the biggest factors, one of the biggest customer feedback elements that Dexcom received from its users is we really want an ability to shut off all alerts. So they built this into the G7 app. You can shut off all alerts for 6 hours. And Europe is okay with that. And the FDA said no. So the FDA, the US version of the G7 app will launch without that capability. And Dexcom remains in conversation with the FDA about trying to just bring some version of can you just shut off all alerts because I'm participating in a wedding for a couple hours, or I'm doing this, or I'm at a concert hall or something else like that. It's the FDA is still not okay with that. There is a little bit, to be fair to the diabetes online community, of noise in the system about the Bluetooth signal on the G7 being, for whatever reason, a little bit frustrating to G7 users in Europe who've already had a few months of experience with it. So signal loss seems to be a pretty common talking point amongst G7 users, that, my phone has to be on the same side of my body as my sensor or something like that. Line of sight is significantly is a factor in trying to prevent signal loss. There hasn't been anything published about this. So the official stance from Dexcom remains that it should be just as good as the G6. But for whatever reason, the early adopter noise has mostly focused on frequent signal losses with the G7. Of course, it's completely new transmitter technology, no separate transmitter, et cetera, et cetera. It is a completely different adhesive. So if we have a patient who has said, I don't want the G6 because the adhesive has caused skin reactions to me, then it's worth having a conversation with them about revisiting. That's completely fair, but this is a new adhesive. Do you want to consider giving it a new shot? Because it's a different product. You still do have the option to calibrate with the G7 once, if you want to. So of course, as I say all that, I know what the real thing that everybody wants to know is, when will it be compatible with Control-IQ, and when will it be compatible with OP5? So this is, if you don't know his face, although it's not a great image of his face, this is Dexcom CEO. He was on several different shows and podcasts and different things over the course of the last month or so since the announcement of the FDA approval. This is from about a week ago, January 17th, so maybe 2 weeks. His official perception, and I would think he knows as well as anyone, is that Control-IQ compatibility, if all goes well, is anticipated for the summer of 2023. OP5 compatibility is not anticipated until Q1 of 2024. So we've got a ways to go unless something goes a whole lot faster than he expects it to go in terms of some of that compatibility. So those are not official statements. Again, I said I would be making unofficial statements. That's just as from the horse's mouth as it gets, I'd like to think. Moving on, other things that caught my eye and or other developments that, I think are worth sharing in this context. If you missed the announcement, Libre, of course, announced their first, now that the Libre 3 is a continuous glucose sensor, they have, of course, brought to the table a product that is potentially compatible with closed loop pumps. So this is not a US market closed loop pump, but I still thought it would be a curiosity for us, if you aren't familiar with it, that they have launched in Germany a closed loop partnership with a pump company that has a big footprint outside of the US, which is the CAM diab, the Ipso pump, CAM APS algorithm, and the Freestyle Libre 3. So there is now a officially approved closed loop pump somewhere in the world. It's only in Germany right now, but it's a great sign that Libre is making inroads into that process, and hopefully a sign of things to come as I look forward to the day, and I'm going to come back to this when I talk about a couple slides from now, when a person with diabetes can say, I want this pump, I want this sensor, and I want this algorithm, and I don't want them to be restricted or locked down to their, respective portals or silos or anything else. So having that option of Libre is starting to become compatible with pumps is great news from my perspective, even if it's a pump that for right now, none of my patients can access. This is not my diagram, but as I think about that future day, this is from a well-known person with type 1 diabetes who has a large social media footprint. Some of you might have heard about him. He uses the name at the right up there of Nerdibetic. He does frequent reviews and updates on diabetes technology and such, and has a YouTube channel that is very popular amongst the diabetes community. He put together this great diagram of these are all the partnerships that we know about in terms of official signed contracts between companies who have pledged to work with each other to develop compatible algorithms, pumps, products, whatever the case may be, across the various companies and across the various pumps that are out there and the various algorithms that are out there. So how far are we from this state? I don't know, but it's nice to see continued slow progress in this direction of cross-compatible products. With that said, I will say in a couple of slides, you'll see that there's a couple of lines that need to be deleted from this just because of very recent announcements within the past couple of weeks. I'll get to that in a second. What about other companies? What's new with Omnipod? I mean, it's strange to be standing here in February 2023 and asking what's new with Omnipod as if OP5 is really old. OP5 has barely been on the market for more than, I don't know, 7-9 months or something like that. And because of the pace of change of things, we are already forgetting just how new it is. So I don't want to forget that, you know what, Omnipod 5 is itself still awfully new. What's new within Omnipod? Well, amongst other things, I wanted to use it as an example of, these are the types of data that all of the closed loop companies and algorithms that are coming online are trying to publish. This is the OP5 pivotal data, right? First off, if you aren't familiar, one of the things I really liked about the Omnipod 5 pivotal trial is they included a lot of pediatric patients in their data, which is great. A full almost half of their subjects were pediatric patients. That's for us who, you know, take care of kids. It's great to see that we don't start with adult trials and then progress to pediatric trials. When it comes to diabetes technology, the companies have learned, let's just include kids right from the get-go. These are the sorts of data that the inclusion of pediatric subjects right from the get-go generated. If you're not familiar with the numbers, 68 to 76% time in range on average for the subjects in the pivotal clinical trial, meaning 76% for, I think 74% for the adolescents, 68% for the younger kids in the OP5 clinical trial in terms of average time in range achieved by OP5 users in the published clinical data. These are the heat maps that sort of compare, you know, this is the OP5 heat map, overlapping, of course, with sensor augmented non-OP5 pump, but you can see the level of especially nighttime control achieved by a lot of these automated insulin delivery algorithms. This tendency towards really tight numbers at target is a very common theme in a lot of AID trial data that has now been published across multiple platforms, not just unique to OP5. Of course, their newest announcements are extension of OP5 approval down to 2 years of age, which is great, again, for those of us who take care of these young kids. What else? Again, as I talk about OP5, I know one of the first things on a lot of people's minds is, what about that iOS app? When is it coming? When is it coming? When is it coming? I find that funny because we ask that question as if there's an Android app. There is an Android app, but that Android app is limited to so few models of Android smartphones that I think the vast majority of Android OP5 users probably carry a separate PDM still, or controller as they call it now. But the official word from Omnipod still is, we're working on it. So I have nothing useful to report in terms of iOS app availability for OP5 users. The other thing that I do want to talk about that I think will impact all of us in the coming year or so is, this is the email that went around just in the last week or two that Omnipod has been sending to Eros pump users. So the Omnipod Eros pump is the term for their first generation pump. If you haven't heard yet, because this is all just within the last week or so, Eros pumps are going away December of 2023. So, and I suspect from many of our DME companies, that might mean even sooner than that, because I don't know. I mean, this is all fresh enough that we don't know. I don't know all of the states and the PESTOLA region as to what that means for each of you guys, but in Texas, our Medicaid only approves Eros pumps. Our Medicaid does not approve DASH. So what does that mean? Will Medicaid begin to approve DASH? Will it not? And will we just not really have an option of prescribing Omnipod to Medicaid patients? We're waiting for that other shoe to drop. I'm super hopeful that this is a push towards let's accept something beyond Eros pumps on the Texas Medicaid side, but to say that we have any certainty of that future would be exaggerating the truth. I think we all need to keep our ears perked to what happens with that. That was a little bit of a surprise to us who, didn't see that coming, I think, from a standpoint of the announcement earlier last week. But December 31st, 2023 is the official statement from Omnipod as to after that, Eros pumps will no longer be available unless something changes between now and then. What about Tandem? Tandem, of course, in the last several months released their option to upgrade your T-Connect app to allow mobile boluses. That does require a little bit of training and a little bit of a process for a patient to go through. It's amazing to me still. I thought that would be super popular amongst t:slim users. The reality is the vast majority of my users who have compatible devices have not gone, at least in my experience, to the trouble to upgrade their app to take advantage of that yet. So I don't know how much of that is getting the word out versus how much of that is not wanting to go to the trouble to sit through the upgrade process. It does take a little bit of training on the part of the user, et cetera, et cetera. But that's available now. What else? The Tandem Mobi pump has been submitted to the FDA. So now Tandem is just waiting to hear on that. That is the smaller form factor pump with very little on-screen or on-device hardware. I think it'll have a button to deliver a bolus, but very little else, meaning it will be completely reliant on your mobile device to control the pump. There won't be any onboard settings for it or anything else. But again, for that segment of our population, which is looking forward to smaller and more discrete devices, that's a step in the right direction and a step in again, more mobile device integrated and more mobile device reliant direction for our Tandem users. And then if you didn't hear the news just earlier last month, Tandem, of course, bought AMF Medical, which is the developer of an alternate patch pump, which I think, again, is a good thing from my perspective of it's great to know that Tandem is beginning to explore tubeless pumps. And to me, this is a concrete step in their direction of one day offering a tubeless pump to compete with Omnipod. More choice from my perspective for our patients in terms of whether they want a tube pump, a tubeless pump, this company's product, that company's product. The more competition, the better. Bring it on from my perspective. What about Medtronic? They have submitted the 780G to the FDA. The 780G is, of course, already earned CE mark approval in Europe, so it's been out for quite some time. We're still on the 770. It will be a software upgrade when it is available. The 780G will be a completely new algorithm with the Guardian 4 sensor. The Guardian 4 sensor is very similar to the Guardian 3 sensor, except it requires much less calibration, a little bit more mobile friendly, but one calibration on the day that you first start using it, and then no further calibration required for the Guardian 4 sensor for the rest of the 7 days of its life. That will be the sensor that is compatible with the 780G once that it receives FDA approval. Far more exciting for me, of course, is this is Medtronic's next gen sensor, which there's a lot of information out about now. I don't think that it's formally earned approval. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't earned approval anywhere, but it's been submitted for CE mark approval, which is why all of this is known. So this is a cross-sectional image of it, still approved for 7 days of wear, at least at initial submission, but they have gone on the record as saying their eventual plan is to try to get this approved for double that in terms of duration of wear. 30-minute warm-up, very different than the current Guardian sensors, very comparable to the G7 when it's released. And MARD's little bit higher. Again, I don't know what that means to me. What's the real clinical world difference between 9% and 10%? But published MARD data on the, this is called the Simplera sensor. That's their next gen sensor. A little bit higher than the Libre 3 and the G7. These are just a couple other images of it. Much simpler application process than anything that's offered by the Guardian suite of products now, if you're familiar with the complexity of applying a Guardian sensor. That's what it looks like on your body compared to what the current Guardian sensors look like on your body. So much more modern device, not yet submitted to the FDA as they work to get the 780 through the FDA first. Anytime I talk about technology, I'm tempted to remind myself that, you know what, for all of the fancy bells and whistles of CGMs and pumps, the vast majority of people with diabetes across the world don't use these devices. So I don't want to forget about the utility of, can we also keep improving on other things? I don't have too much information on updates in the insulin pen and connected pen and smart pen market, but I know I am going to keep an eye out for developments in this space. Medtronic, of course, bought InPen sometime in the last 12, 18, 24 months, I forget now. But InPen is now much more accessible to us who take care of patients who might be using an InPen because it's now compatible with CareLink. So this whole, can you email me a PDF of your InPen report that maybe many of us have been dealing with for the first couple of years of InPen's availability to our patients, InPen data being available in CareLink will certainly decrease just the hurdle of how do we access our smart pen users' data. And then this was super exciting to me as somebody who is looking again forward to that day where you can truly just pick your device, pick your sensor, pick your algorithm. If you are familiar with do-it-yourself APS and looping, as it's referred to in the diabetes community, then you know this was big news in that world, which is loop, which is a term for the do-it-yourself APS app that some small segment of our patients with diabetes have been using for years now, was officially approved by the FDA just a couple weeks ago. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'll talk about why 1 step back in a second. But again, overall, I think this is great news in that general direction of I want choice for my patients. There's a long way to go in terms of this being actually available to patients, but to know that Tidepool, which is of course the data aggregation service that maybe many of us use in our clinics, was able to take this app and run it through the FDA and get it officially FDA cleared is proof of principle that we are headed in a good direction when it comes to increasing choice available to our patients. So it will have direct watch control of insulin pumps at launch, which is something that's available on the current Loop app. It introduces essentially this, I mean, we're becoming alphabet soup, right? So ACE pumps, if you're not familiar with the algorithm, means alternate controller enabled pumps. That's what all of our modern AID delivery devices are. ICGM means the CGM that can control an ACE pump. And IAGC, interoperable automated glycemic controller. So IAGC Tidepool Loop is the first official FDA approved IAGC, meaning interoperable algorithm that can be paired with whatever pump it eventually is approved for use with. And hopefully the first of many to come as it lays a path for somebody who wants to develop an alternate app to say, hey, you can follow the footsteps that Tidepool followed to get your app approved by the FDA as well. So you don't have to build an App Store account and a developer account to go this route if you want to, which is what our current do-it-yourself community has to do. How much time do I have? Am I over time? 2 minutes, sorry. I won't get into the details of tide pool loop then. I want to leave a minute for question. I do want to talk about, I'll skip the eyelet too. I want to talk about a couple of things that I think are super important before I leave the topic of technology. As we have reflected on, what are we doing with technology in our practice, we become more keenly aware of two things that I want to also just propose is important for all of us to think about as we continue to just adopt technology in greater numbers. And are we adopting it in greater numbers right now? In our practice in Dallas, these are as of last week, we have over 400 patients who are on closed loop technology. So this is up from 200 just a year ago. So we are seeing a almost exponential rise in the adoption of closed loop technology in our patients. But as we do so, and I won't talk about the evidence behind its utility, there are a couple slides here on just a comparison of all the different closed loop sensors, which if we make the slides available, I'm hoping is a good reference for anybody who wants to see that in writing. One of the things we become aware of is we have significant discrepancies. We chart this monthly in our clinic on the rate of utilization of these technology across different segments of our population. And this is me airing our dirty laundry a little bit, but I think for purposes of just raising the volume around this topic of conversation, it's important that we confront some of these data. And that's what we're trying to do in our clinic is, you can see our pump utilization in our non-Hispanic whites and compare that to our pump utilization, or sorry, this is commercial versus non-commercial, but you can see very similar gradients in comparing non-Hispanic whites to Blacks or Hispanics across the last several months in our clinic. And I think we as a community have a long way to go to really make sure that we are providing equal opportunity for access to all of these services and tools across the various across the various segments of our population. And then certainly one of the last challenges that I know we look forward to confronting in our clinic is a lot of our technology is really leaving other environments behind. If I have a kid with a closed loop pump who shows up in our emergency room, I have no confidence about what kind of care are they going to get right now. If I have a kid, I just had a kid on a closed loop pump who was admitted for a TNA. I was super happy that our floor was essentially willing to look the other way and let him use his closed loop pump. He came to me having stayed on his closed loop pump throughout his procedure. And at some level, I was surprised that anesthesia didn't make him take it off. I know when he gets admitted to our floor, I know how he'll be treated, but how he is treated is we essentially have no way of effectively interfacing any of his tools with our EHR. So we kind of bury our head in the sand and say, you know what, I'm going to trust that it's going to take care of your diabetes. Okay, there is a future that is beyond that we need to strive for in terms of how our kids get cared for at dentist offices and when they need imaging studies and when they get sick with something not related to diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. So that is one of the challenges I anticipate our practice devoting a lot of energy to in the coming years. And with that, I'll stop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adhikari. We're going to switch around some things here. It looks like we don't see anything in the chat. Oh, actually, there's one here. Does Texas Medicaid approve Libre 3?
That's a great question. It does not yet because CMS, so this is not a Texas Medicaid rule, but CMS, so Medicare also does not approve the Libre 3 because there's no reader option for the Libre 3, and CMS still requires that a sensor have at least an option for a non-mobile phone reader in order for them to approve that. I'm hopeful for a day when that is not a requirement. For now, that's a requirement.
Probably have time for one more question. I don't know if there's one here in our audience in our room. I was going to say, I'm not being able to see the one online yet. See if there's anybody else. Okay. I think I'll ask this really quickly because I think we struggle with the same thing you're talking about here at the end of what to do in the hospital setting. Outside of, regulations and stuff, do you think that we're going to have eventually a medical record that will integrate while they're there, to be able to integrate and upload settings through that.
I can't imagine a world where that's not possible, right? So it's just a matter of breaking down all the hurdles between getting this system to talk to that system. And I would like to think that in 2023, you can get computers to talk to each other without reinventing too many wheels. But it makes too much sense for me for the answer not to be yes, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Oh, okay, one more real quick.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk. I had a quick question. In the initial data that you showed, the decrease in DKA with use of technology. This is something that I struggle with. For people who really want to use CGM, who want to use technology, it really helps. Do we have any technology that's coming up for those non-compliant adolescent patients who really don't want to do anything, whatever we do? So that's something that I have always struggled with.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could be said about that. I think part of it is probably reflecting a little bit carefully on our own biases of who are we prescribing this technology to. And, I think in our practice, we've confronted a little bit do you have to be well controlled and not labeled as quote unquote non-compliant for us to be willing to prescribe you technology? Or do we need to revisit that thought process a little bit and think about how much the person who has struggled with their diabetes might actually be the perfect candidate to benefit from some of these? The reason I put this slide back up is because I also think one of the things that is a barrier to increased utilization is just the complexity of some of this technology. So if you're familiar with the iLet pump, one of the things that makes it different, it's now also been submitted to the FDA. There's only one setting in the iLet pump, and that's your weight. There's no basal rate, there's no boluses, there's no carb ratios, there's no correction factor. The only setting is your weight. That's the way the algorithm works. So simplifying algorithms is also, I think, one answer to how do we make them more useful for the right patients? Because, are we getting them into the hands of everybody who needs it? No.